Good morning. It is a real pleasure to be here and to be able to take such an important audience through some concepts that I believe and we believe are essential to the management of avian influenza infections in animals, and particularly to the management of H5N1. I have been given the task of taking you through the concepts, at least, of DIVA strategies. DIVA is an acronym that is very much used nowadays, and it stands for differentiating infected from vaccinated animals. This concept is a concept that has started many, many years ago in veterinary medicine, and is a system or a strategy by which you are able to map infection within a vaccinated population. From the experience that we have with avian influenza, we know that it is extremely important that we understand what is happening in our vaccinated populations in order to better manage the vaccination campaign, since the aim of vaccination, particularly with reference to H5N1, is that of eradicating infection. Before I start to go into the details of DIVA strategies, I think it is important to deliver a few concepts because we are facing a moving target. Controlling avian influenza is really an enormous challenge for the veterinary community and for local administrations. And it is the first time in history that such a panzootic has occurred, and the ecology and epidemiology of this disease are in constant evolution as it spreads to new ecosystems and hosts. And therefore, it is unthinkable to believe that we can manage this emergency without significant funds and resources. And these funds and resources are to be used in an organized manner, all heading in the same direction. And of course, we are going to make mistakes. And therefore, we should learn from our mistakes, and we should share our mistakes with other decision makers and with other people that are involved in this, in managing this problem, so that we can maximize the outcome of the efforts that we are making on a global scale. So what tools do we have to control and prevent avian influenza? The speakers that have spoken before me have, of course, introduced some of these. I would just like to touch on them very briefly before I get into the detail of vaccines and DIVA strategies. The first and most important tool that we must use is training and investing in knowledge. We must strengthen the response capacities of countries that are affected, because I always say that if avian influenza has proven to be a difficult disease to manage in developed countries, such as Italy, such as the Netherlands, such as the United States, it is obviously much more difficult to try and manage this disease in countries that don't have the knowledge and don't have the infrastructure to tackle it in an appropriate manner. And I believe it is our responsibility to help these countries in the struggle, because it's not only their problem, it's everybody's problem. Biosecurity is perhaps the most important measure that can be put in place to prevent and to control the spread of avian influenza, because primary introduction and secondary spread are caused by insufficient bioexclusion and biocontainment at the farm level. This means that if you have good biosecurity in place, avian influenza can be kept out of the premise. It is primarily the movement of infected animals, the movement of contaminated materials, of equipment, and of course the movement of staff that carry with them organic material that can be the starting point for the infection in a given farm. And then, of course, we have vaccination. I have put together some slides to try and present to you how our poultry farms are, in fact, in certain situations around the world under a crossfire, because they are surrounded by sources of infection, and therefore they are at high risk of infection. We have, for example, live bird markets that we know are a source of infection for industrial poultry. Live bird markets manifest themselves in many, many different ways, and it is the movement of animals to and from the live bird markets, and of course the movement of staff that work on the live bird markets and possibly on the industrial farm that act as vehicles of infection. We have backyard farms and other animals. The role of other animals has yet to be clarified, but certainly H5N1 is a virus that can infect a variety of mammalian hosts, and it is not excluded that these mammalian hosts may also represent a source of infection for poultry. Of course, we have some types of farming, like farming in the open, free-range farming, particularly in some areas of Eastern Asia. There is intensive farming on, for example, rivers and on ponds, and these birds are in contact with wild birds, and wild birds, we have seen, can harbor the virus and can also transport the virus over significant distances. And then we have transportation. We have legal transportation of poultry, legal movements of poultry, and illegal movements of poultry. Certainly, if the poultry that is transported and that is moved is infected, it represents, of course, a source, both as itself as poultry, but also as through the vehicle that is carrying that poultry. And finally, I've put here a picture of an abattoir, because the contacts that farms have with abattoirs through vehicles and through staff can certainly represent, the abattoir can represent a sort of a central point where material from infected farms is conveyed and can then start off to infect other premises. Now, with biosecurity, we can develop a firewall around the farm, but at times, due to many different reasons, it is not possible to build a firewall that is 100% efficient. And this is where vaccination can be used in an appropriate manner, because vaccination can be used to maximize the outcome of biosecurity measures. It can be used as an additional measure to protect our birds from infection. So biosecurity and vaccination, of course, there isn't a golden recipe for how to use biosecurity and vaccination. What I can say is that we need to develop tailored synergies on the basis of variables that characterize that given area or that given region or that given country. The ecology and epidemiology of avian influenza are very different in various parts of the world, and of course this must be taken into account. The real risk of introduction into a given compartment must be taken into account, and of course the characteristics of the poultry industry in its entirety. It is our experience that although there are different sectors of the poultry industry, there is the industrial sector, there is the rural sector, there are live bird markets, there are overlappings that take place, and therefore we should not consider the sectors as isolated sectors, but we should consider them as parts of one system and act in a way that the whole system is kept under control and the whole system is well understood, including the critical points of each sector of that system. So what we should do is we should combine the strategies that are available, the strategies that we have put in place in different parts of the world, and try to find for each situation a tailored strategy which will be more successful than just applying blanket concepts without looking at the detail of that particular situation. The colleagues that have spoken before me have already introduced the advantages of using vaccine for avian influenza. Generally speaking, international organizations recommend that whatever vaccination system you decide to use, this system should some way enable the DIVA strategy. So it should enable public veterinary officers and the public veterinary services to map the infection within the vaccinated population. The advantages of using vaccine, we have heard earlier, vaccination increases resistance to field challenge, it reduces shedding levels, it reduces transmission dynamics. However, it may not prevent infection. And this is the crucial point of where correctly understanding the DIVA strategies comes into practice. A few words on vaccination. Until year 2000, vaccination for avian influenza was of no interest virtually to anyone, to pharmaceutical companies or to the poultry industry. And therefore, poultry veterinarians and decision makers do not have a great deal of experience with vaccination for avian influenza. And of course, we have seen that trade barriers may follow the implementation of a vaccination campaign in a given country. Certainly, if we vaccinate and then forget about it, this will most likely result in endemicity. Instead, if we vaccinate and monitor and manage the vaccination campaign appropriately, this will result in eradication. And therefore, a vaccination campaign, in order to be successful and achieve the goal of eradication, must be managed appropriately. So, in a nutshell, where is the problem? The problem is that vaccination may not prevent infection, and therefore vaccinated exposed birds will shed virus, and the amount of virus shed is sufficient to generate secondary outbreaks. And therefore, what we need to do is we need to identify the field exposed flocks, and we need to deal with them. And we need to ensure that these field exposed flocks will not generate any secondary outbreaks. What vaccines do we have? Since 2000, there has been an immense increase in the amount of energy and of resources that have been put in research institutions and in pharmaceutical companies to prepare vaccines for AI. And at the moment, there are a variety of different products that have different characteristics and different properties. It is not possible to recommend one type of vaccine or one type of diagnostic test. Each country, on the basis of the situation it has, and on the basis, I said, of the ecology and the epidemiology and the risk of AI introduction and spread, should select the most suitable vaccine. And of course, and this is not a choice, if a country decides to vaccinate, the country must put in place surveillance program to evaluate what is happening, to see how much the virus is circulating in the vaccinated population, but also, as Dr. Suarez said earlier, to identify drifted variants, because we know that antigenic drift may occur with avian influenza viruses as well. Another point which comes back to Dr. Suarez's talk is that vaccines must be of proven quality. We must use vaccines that are good, that are efficacious, and that are stored properly, and we must use them at the recommended dose. The vaccination system that we use must allow the DIVA principle. We must use validated companion tests. The monitoring programs that are developed must be fit for purpose and must be managed in a flexible manner. So if, for example, we see that the situation is evolving in a certain direction, the monitoring program may be intensified in order to understand better what is happening and to obtain more information from the field. And of course, infected flocks have to be managed in the appropriate way in order to avoid the perpetuation of infection. So just a few slides to try and show you what we mean exactly by implementing a DIVA system. If we have an unvaccinated population, and this has been shown, it has been shown by many studies, also from studies performed by Gus Koch that would follow me. If we have an unvaccinated population and infection is introduced, what will happen is that we will have spread of infection very, very fast, and the vast majority of the premises in that given area will become infected. Now, instead, if we have an unvaccinated population, what have we seen in practice without getting too much into detailed mathematical calculations, which I think can be at times quite difficult to comprehend? What we have seen is that, yes, infection can be introduced in a vaccinated population. So you can have flocks that, although they are vaccinated, they can become infected. However, since these flocks are vaccinated, they will shed less virus. And therefore, instead of having the spread of infection throughout the population, as we saw in the previous slide, infection may spread to other flocks, but it will not spread to the whole population. And this reduced spread is also determined by the increased resistance to infection that our vaccinated birds have. So it is a double effect. We have, on one hand, our vaccinated birds that shed less. On the other hand, we have our vaccinated birds that are more resistant, and therefore spread will not be as massive as if the population were not vaccinated. But where does the DIVA system come in? The DIVA system and monitoring programs come in because what we need to do is that we need to understand and we need to identify flocks as soon as they get infected. So if infection enters a given area or a given compartment, we need to have a monitoring program that is able to tell us that flock is infected within a reasonable amount of time before this flock can infect other flocks. And what we do, and what we should do, and what we must do, and what we have done in Italy, is that we put the flocks under restriction. And if you put them under restriction, you avoid the additional spread of virus to other flocks. And if you slaughter them and you cull them, then you will have, the infection will not progress and will not spread to the rest of the population and therefore you will maintain a free status. But in order to do this, you need to have a monitoring program that allows you to identify infection at the early stages. Okay, now what do we have? What is available on the market now that allows the DIVA strategy? What vaccines do we have? What tests do we have? In very general terms, we have vaccines that are made with the whole virion. So these can be field viruses, or they can be viruses that have been generated in the laboratory, like reassortants, or viruses that have been completely made in the laboratory, like viruses made by reverse genetics. These viruses have the characteristics of the biological characteristics of the field viruses. They are inactivated and blended with an adjuvant, and this is what makes our so-called conventional vaccine. We also have recombinant vaccines. These vaccines are based on a vector virus that is not an influenza virus. It is a vector virus that carries in its genome a portion of the influenza virus. And that portion of the influenza virus is responsible for the stimulation of protective immunity. These viruses, recombinant viruses, are not natural viruses. They are viruses that have been generated in the laboratory. How can we apply our DIVA system, our DIVA strategies, to conventional viruses? If the virus is of the same subtype as the virus in the field, for example, you prepare your vaccine with H5N1 and you have H5N1 that is circulating in the field, then one of the systems you can use is to leave unvaccinated sentinels. So you leave some birds that are not vaccinated. These birds, of course, will be susceptible to the clinical disease in case of highly pathogenic avian influenza and will therefore die, or else they will seroconvert in case we are dealing with a virus that is not as pathogenic. So infected sentinels may be identified either through serology or through clinical signs. Another system which was developed and used in Italy is based on using a seed virus that has a different neuraminidase subtype from the field strain. So for example, your vaccine would contain H5N2 and your field strain is H5N1. Cross protection is ensured by the same H subtype, the same hemagglutinin. Both these viruses are H5. But what you have is that in your vaccinated birds, if the birds are only vaccinated, you will have antibodies to N2. So you will have antibodies to H5 and antibodies to N2. If your vaccinated birds have also come in contact with a field virus, these birds will have antibodies to H5 from the vaccine and from the field exposure. They will have antibodies to N2, which is the virus that is contained in the vaccine, but they will also have antibodies to N1. And therefore, the detection of antibodies, in this case to N1, represents the proof of a field exposure, and therefore these antibodies can be used as markers of infection. There is also another system that is at the moment at an experimental level, which is the detection of antibodies to the non-structural protein. Now, This system can be used with viruses of any subtype, provided the hemagglutinin is of the same subtype of the field virus. Now, non-structural proteins are proteins that are produced only during active viral replication. So if we use an inactivated vaccine, this vaccine will not generate, will not contain great amounts, will only contain traces of non-structural protein, and therefore an animal that is vaccinated and not field exposed will not have antibodies to the non-structural protein. If instead we have a superinfection of a vaccinated animal with a field virus, this field virus will replicate, and in replicating it will produce non-structural proteins, and the animal will produce antibodies to the non-structural protein. Theory is one thing and practice is another thing. What are the practical experiences that we have had with these systems? The detection of field exposure through sentinel birds is feasible. However, it may be impractical, particularly when the birds are raised in the field, and therefore our sentinel birds are not confined to cages, but they are free to mix with other birds. And it can be quite difficult to identify a bird for its whole economic life. So it just requires a bit more of work from the veterinarians that are in the field and that are in charge of bleeding these sentinels and of testing these sentinels. However, in some instances, it may be the only way forward. And for example, in areas of the world that are remote, and one way to, a simple way to use the sentinel system, particularly in backyard flocks, is to vaccinate only the females. Now, as we know, females produce eggs and meat, and there are more females in a flock generally than males. So what can be done is that females can be vaccinated while males are left unvaccinated, and if the infection enters that given flock, then the males will show clinical signs or seroconvert or die. And this will certainly be an indication, or will be something that can be reported to the authorities as a suspicion of disease. The DIVA system detecting antibodies to the neuraminidase protein has been successful in eradicating infection. We have used it for many years in Italy, and it is a very good system. There is the risk that if other avian influenza subtypes are introduced in the vaccinated population, this may interfere with diagnosis and with the diagnostic test. With reference to the NS1 approach, it is currently still under validation. There are several experiments that are going on in different parts of the world to validate the test with field samples and under a field situation. Of course, the introduction of any avian influenza subtype in this case, and therefore not necessarily the avian influenza subtype that we are trying to eradicate, will interfere with the diagnostic test as well. With reference to recombinant vaccines, we're talking about vector-based vaccines. At the moment on the market, we have two types of vaccines. One is based on a Newcastle disease vector, and I believe that this is produced and commercialized primarily in China. And there is a fowlpox vaccine, which expresses the H5 hemagglutinin, and this vaccine has been on the market or has been available for quite a long time, and it has been studied quite well. We know that these recombinant vaccines induce protective immunity and reduce shedding levels. We also know that since only a small portion of the influenza virus is expressed in these systems, and this portion is the hemagglutinin, we know that antibodies that are induced by vaccination will not contain any of the other influenza proteins. Like, for example, it would serum samples from vaccinated animals will not have antibodies to the nucleoprotein, will not have antibodies to the neuraminidase, will not have proteins to the will not have antibodies to the M protein, or in fact to the non-structural proteins. The practicalities of the use of these vaccines, it is known that the immune status of the host to the vector virus influences the take, and therefore the immune response to avian influenza. This means that if the birds that we are going to vaccinate have antibodies either for prior vaccination or for field exposure to the vector virus, it is possible that the vaccine will not replicate sufficiently to give a protective titer to the avian influenza component. And therefore, these aspects of using recombinant vaccines should be better investigated. And of course, there is the host issue, because some of these vaccines do not replicate in hosts, like, for example, in ducks. And therefore, when a country is deciding which vaccine to use, it is very important that the variety of different birds and the percentage and the share of birds in the whole population is considered, because this will, of course, influence the choice of the vaccine. A few words on field application, which unfortunately is very often overlooked, and instead is one of the biggest problems that you have in implementing a vaccination campaign. One thing is vaccinating birds in the laboratory, and one thing is vaccinating them in the field. Compliance is always lower in the field to what it is under experimental conditions. We have issues of storage of vaccine, of blending the vaccine with other vaccines, and so on. And of course, there are some immunosuppressive diseases that can influence the immune response to the vaccine. And also, there is a lot of work that still needs to be done to identify the most efficient vaccination programs, the timing of interventions within the different categories of poultry that are reared for meat or for eggs. What I'm saying is that you cannot apply the same program to a turkey and to a layer or to a broiler. There needs to be different programs that are applied in the framework of the same vaccination program. And also, we need to make sure that we use in the field the programs which yield the best results, that, for example, are most efficient in completely suppressing shedding, because we now do have some products that that claim that they can suppress shedding completely. In this slide, I have tried to summarize what the most important and things that a decision maker must do when and after he has decided, or the group of decision makers has decided, that they must vaccinate in that given country. Of course, we have pressure from international organizations to perform vaccination in a certain way. We have national authorities that pressurize in another direction, and the decision makers in the middle that have to filter all this information and develop a program that will eventually lead to eradication and that is applicable in that given country or area or farming system. And the three main points that I have identified is that the decision maker must select and source the vaccine that he believes, or he or she believes, is the best product in that given situation. And of course, this decision must include, as I said, sourcing. We must make sure that we have enough vaccine available to perform a vaccination program which lasts a year or 2 years. And the supply must be constant. And we must identify the test to be used in the DIVA strategy. The decision makers must also prepare and adjust the vaccination and monitoring programs. And this is possibly one of the most difficult things, because the vaccination program must not be seen as a static program. It has to be flexible and it has to be dynamic. And therefore, constant inputs must be put into the management and into the updating of the vaccination and monitoring program. And of course, the decision maker must find a way to provide resources, because there are two levels which depend from the path that has been shown or that has been identified by the decision maker, and that are the laboratory, which must be able to perform diagnostic tests to make sure that the vaccine is working in the field and that it is giving the results that are expected. And the laboratory tests must be aimed to monitoring the circulation of the virus in the field, and therefore to mapping infection within the vaccinated population, but also outside the vaccinated population. And of course, laboratories must characterize, must obtain isolates and must characterize isolates to see what is happening to these viruses from an antigenic and from a genetic point of view. The other front which acts in the management of a vaccination campaign is, of course, the field. And here we have field veterinarians that are in charge of managing the infected flocks or the infected areas. They have to coordinate sampling activities and send the samples to the laboratory. And of course, they must perform clinical surveillance to see if there are any clinical indications that some disease is circulating in the vaccinated flocks. And I don't only mean influenza. As I said, if you have other viruses like immunosuppressive viruses, these can cause a lot more problems, and they require to be managed in the appropriate way. But all this information has to be fed back to the decision makers, so that the decision makers can adjust the vaccination program and can adjust the monitoring program. And so it becomes a flexible system with inputs that generate changes or modifications, so that slowly we can chase the virus out of the infected area and gain and reach the objective of eradication. I've just made a short list of what we have seen up to now with controlling avian influenza through vaccination. And in fact, the message of this slide is that it's not so much the vaccine you use, but it's the monitoring that really makes the difference. We have had, in Mexico, they have used both inactivated and recombinant vaccines. The monitoring has not been sufficiently developed to manage the infected flocks appropriately, and they still have, in Mexico, H5N2, the low pathogenic virus is still circulating. In a similar way, in Pakistan, in H7N3, they used an inactivated vaccine, no monitoring, and they still have infection. In the Middle and Far East, we know that H9N2 is widespread, is present from virtually, yes, from the Middle East all the way to China. And billions of doses of inactivated vaccine have been used, and they still have infection. In Hong Kong, they used a heterologous inactivated, they used a DIVA system, and they managed to eradicate it, or at least keep it out of the territories. And in Italy also, we used the heterologous inactivated, the DIVA system, and we eradicated infection. So in fact, as I said, personally, I believe that if the vaccine is of good quality, what is really important and what is crucial is that we have a good monitoring system and a system that enables the management of infected flocks in a prompt and efficient manner. This is a slide that introduces to my next slide, because as I said at the beginning of my talk, biosecurity and vaccination need to be used together. We cannot vaccinate without implementing good biosecurity measures. And just to give you an idea of what has been done in several parts of the world, I take the example of Italy because, of course, I'm Italian, and because I know much more about it. We have the example of the Netherlands and the example of the United States. In Italy, we vaccinated the area at high risk of infection. We increased biosecurity in industrial and backyard farms. So we have a combination of vaccination and of biosecurity. In the Netherlands, they identified the categories that were at risk, and they increased biosecurity in the industrial farms. And of course, in the United States, they increased biosecurity in the live bird markets, and in certain instances, they used vaccination with a DIVA system, and they were able to eradicate the H7N2 from a very, very big layer operation. And this takes me to my final slides. I've put up this slide because my laboratory has been very, very active in trying to support developing countries in the diagnosis and the control of avian influenza. We have, in collaboration with FAO, we have organized technical cooperation programs in the Middle East and in Africa. And I do think that all of the theory that I have gone through remains and is just words if we don't then have the people that can do things. And what is important is that as an international scientific community, we promote these exchanges, and we promote particularly, and here I'm referring particularly to developed countries, we promote supporting developing countries. Because, as I said, it's not our problem, it's not their problem, it's everybody's problem, and therefore we need to work together. And another point that I would like to stress is that we need to share our experiences. We need to make available, for example, the protocols that are used to sanitize farms. We need to deliver the basic concepts behind the use of vaccination. We need to help staff in laboratories in developing countries or in laboratories that have never managed such a disease. or in laboratories that don't have experience with influenza diagnosis, we need to help them. And we need to help them to understand how you can map the presence of infection in a vaccinated population. And this leads me to the final couple of slides and the final concept I would like to deliver. I believe that it is important that strategies need to be developed on a country-by-country basis. I don't think that any of us has a magic wand or that can give a recipe for everyone. I believe that each country must find its way on the basis of what we have available and must use the tools we have in a synergic effort. It is important that countries make available their vaccination programs, make available their monitoring programs, and make available the strains that they isolate so that we as an international community can identify the areas of failure and we can improve. And of course we can monitor closely the virus because drifted variants are going to emerge more and more. And also vaccination programs must be seen in a flexible manner, and they must therefore be updated on the basis of a situation that is constantly changing. This will lead, if we manage to have accredited control and prevention policies, what we will have is we will have harmonized intervention protocols, and so people will be doing the same thing. We will share our experiences, and of course this will progressively lead to a removal of trade barriers. My real take-home message is this one. Decision makers in the veterinary field have now a very big responsibility, simply because the management of avian influenza, both for animal health and for public health, must be focused on animals, and particularly in birds, because these represent the reservoirs and represent the means by which the virus perpetuates itself in the environment. And the spillover that we have to humans at the moment are just spillovers. But if we don't manage the virus in the animal reservoir, it will be extremely difficult that we are able to manage the animal health implications of this disease, but also the human health implications of the disease. Thank you.